Elizabeth and the Match Girl. Written by Steam Art. Read by TARDIS9. Based on The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, the Railway series by the Reverend Wilbert Awdry, and Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends by Britt Allcroft and David Mitten. Snow was falling on the island of Sodor. Terence the Tractor and Byron the Bulldozer were assigned to clear the roads, but a team was also required to spread grit behind them as they worked. Elizabeth, the vintage lorry, was asked to collect the grit, while Jack and Alfie scooped it out by the bucket load and poured it onto the road in the wake of whoever happened to be clearing the snow. The operation went on for several days, and soon it was December the 23rd. That morning was spent in clearing the roads throughout Tidmouth, and at lunchtime, Jack, Alfie and Elizabeth stopped for a breather at the bus depot, where they'd hoped to see Bertie. They didn't have long to wait before Bertie arrived. "Thanks for clearing the roads, you lot," he said as his passengers disembarked. "Snow's bad enough at the best of times without making the roads slippery." "Oh, don't talk to me about slippery roads," said Elizabeth with a shiver, remembering the time she'd had to deliver Christmas puddings and whizzed straight into a snowdrift. Idly, she watched the pedestrians trudge back and forth across the snowy pavements. They seem keen to get home to their families. "That reminds me," said Jack. "Bertie, are you and the other buses busy Christmas Day?" "Well, we normally shut up shop from tomorrow onwards. Why?" "Because Miss Jenny asked me and Alfie to invite you all to our Christmas party at the yard the day after tomorrow. All the road vehicles are invited. Even George." Bertie grinned. "Course I'll come. I'll tell the others as well." Jack glanced at Elizabeth. "You're invited too if you want to come. What do you say?" Elizabeth didn't answer. She was staring at something on the other side of the road. "What are you looking at?" asked Alfie. "Turn your eyes to that street corner, boys," Elizabeth commanded. "What do you see?" Bertie, Jack and Alfie followed her gaze. There, standing beneath a lamppost, was a small, thin girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Despite the snow, she was wearing a faded blue dress, a threadbare pinafore, and a ragged headscarf. Her small face was grimy, and her golden hair unkempt. Clutched in her hands was what looked like an open shoebox. "What's she doing out there all alone?" asked Jack. "Where's her parents?" "Shh," whispered Bertie. "I think she's saying something." Sure enough, whenever someone walked past the girl, she would hold out the box and call out, "Matches! Who'll buy my matches?" in a thin, cracked voice. "Hey you, little girl!" shouted Elizabeth abruptly, causing the girl to look up. "Come here!" Slowly and carefully, the girl crossed the road and approached the 4 vehicles. When she got closer to them, they could see that she wasn't wearing shoes. "Will you buy my matches?" she asked hopefully, thrusting out the box. "Genuine Aspen, only—" "What's your name?" interrupted Elizabeth. The girl paused and then mumbled something that sounded like, "Jane." "Well, Jane, I'm Elizabeth, and this is Bertie, Jack and Alfie. Now then, what's a young lady like you doing out here all alone in this weather, in clothes like those, without any shoes?" "I have to sell my matches," faltered Jane. "Mum and Dad ordered me to." "They what?" burst out Jack, horrified. "Why would they do that? Where are they now?" "Oh, at home. They told me I must sell these matches to get us through Christmas, or I won't even see the new year." "Do you mean to say that your parents sent you out with that box of matches so you can earn money for them?" demanded Elizabeth. Jane nodded. "Very well then. First things first, our drivers should be back soon." "What are you up to?" said Bertie apprehensively. "You could get into trouble if this girl's parents find you've been chatting with their daughter." "Poppycock! This girl needs a proper meal inside her, and I know just the person who can provide it." Just then their drivers returned. "Sarah," called Elizabeth, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Her driver hurried up. "What's wrong now?" "Sarah, this is Jane. She's out here all by herself and half frozen. Would you be so kind as to provide her with a good square meal?" Sarah frowned. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Jane looked even more uncomfortable. Is this woman safe?" "Safe? Of course! This is Sarah, my driver for the last 10 years. You can trust her." Just then, Bertie's driver called out. "Hey Sarah, we're off to a cafe for lunch. You want to join us? They've got toad in a hole today." "Thanks, Ted," Sarah called back. "I'll be right with you." She turned to Jane. "Is that okay with you?" Jane nodded vigorously, all awkwardness gone. Sarah took her hand and gently led her over to the other drivers, who in turn went into the cafe Ted had chosen. "Well, things are looking up," said Alfie. "That girl looked famished to me." "Good call, Elizabeth." "What girl?" said a voice. They looked up to see that Terence had stopped nearby. "We've found a match girl," said Jack proudly. "You mean a girl made of matches?" "No, a girl selling matches." "Oh, well, my driver could do with some matches, and so could Farmer Finney. He needs them to warm up his barns and his farmhouse." "Looks like Jane's got her first customer," said Bertie. He glanced towards the cafe. "I think I'll just go and see if I can spot her. You chaps can come if you like." In the end, Bertie, Jack and Elizabeth clustered around the cafe window in an effort to spot Jane. "We've seen her," Jack said when they rejoined Terence and Alfie. "She and Sarah were eating their toad in a hole, and you should have seen Jane. She was wolfing away like she hadn't eaten for a week." "That's probably true," said Elizabeth darkly. In a bid to change the subject, Alfie told Terence that he was also invited to their party. "I'll come, never fear," promised Terence. "And I'll see if I can find Trevor and Caroline too, if you like." "No need, they already know." The 5 of them chatted away for another 10 minutes, and then their drivers returned. Jane followed them, and she was looking a lot better than she had when she entered the depot. "We've decided that Jane could try her luck with the chaps at the depot," Ted explained. "It can get really cold for us drivers on these long winter nights." "Don't I know it," chuckled Bertie. "Come on, Jane, it's right this way." Half an hour passed before Jane reappeared. Her box was now empty of matches and rattled with cash. "Those matches sold like hot cakes," Sarah told Elizabeth and the others. "We've all got an afternoon of work ahead of us, so we'd better get going." "If you don't mind," said Elizabeth, "I've got something to do first." "What's that?" asked Alfie. "Why, take Jane home, of course." Jane, who had been hitherto smiling, suddenly looked worried. "Are you sure, Elizabeth? I don't think my dad would like it if they'd know I've been with you." "Stop the nonsense," scoffed Elizabeth. "A little girl like you isn't as used to the cold as the likes of us. Besides, I've a good mind to give your alleged father a piece of my mind." Jack and Alfie looked at each other, but knew better than to voice their thoughts. Soon Elizabeth was rolling along the country roads with Jane sitting next to Sarah in her cab. They came to a terrace of houses a couple of miles outside Tidmouth, and Jane pointed to one of them, prompting Sarah to slow the lorry down and apply the handbrake. "Well, this is my home," said Jane, feeling a little awkward. Thanks for your help." "No problem," said Sarah with a smile, opening the door for Jane. Elizabeth said nothing, and continued to do so as Jane walked up to her front door and knocked. After a while it was opened by an unkempt and sour-looking middle-aged man. He scowled at Jane. "What are you doing back so soon? I told you not to come home without selling all your matches." "But I have, Dad." said Jane. "Look!" And she showed him her empty box. Elizabeth was about to explain about the kind men at the bus depot when the man grabbed Jane by the arm and, despite her protests, hauled her over the threshold. "Well, since you've got nothing better to do," he growled, "you can sweep this house all over. I want to see those floors spotless by dinner time or there'll be no dinner." Elizabeth could stand it no longer. "I say!" she cried. "What do you think you're doing? That girl's your daughter!" Jane's father jumped and spun around to face Elizabeth. "Mind your own business," he snapped. "I don't need to be dictated to by an old Sentinel lorry." "That's vintage Sentinel lorry," retorted Elizabeth. "And for your information, I helped your daughter sell those matches of hers down at the bus depot. You don't desert our children if you send them out into the cold without so much as a pair of shoes." At this point, a thin, vinegar-faced woman emerged from the hall. "What's this I hear about a bus depot?" she asked. "Jane's been selling her matches down there," the man explained. "This lorry decided to interfere." The woman glared at Elizabeth. "You should know better than to meddle with things that had nothing to do with you." "Madam," said Elizabeth haughtily, "I beg to differ. The least you can do is let Jane keep her hard-earned money." "What gave you that idea?" sneered Jane's father. "She's done nothing to earn the money. Nah, that money will go to something far more worthwhile than her. A nice bottle of gin for me and the missus." He turned to his wife. "What do you say, Poppet?" "You're a mind reader," Jane's mother said. To Jane herself, she said, "As for you, you'd better do as your father said. And for chatting with strangers, you can join your gran in the attic." Elizabeth almost let rip again, but was cut short because Jane's father told her, "If I ever see you round her again, I'll phone the police on you," and slammed the front door. A moment later, the curtains in the front room slid shut. "Well, I never!" spluttered Elizabeth, beside herself with indignation. "They've got a nerve!" "I couldn't agree with you more," said Sarah, "but there's not much we can do. We'd better be getting back to work before that man really does phone the police." "We can't just leave Jane in that place," said Elizabeth as she reluctantly set off back the way she'd come. "No, we can't. But how do we go about getting her out?" Elizabeth had to admit that she was stumped. But that wasn't going to stop her trying. For the rest of the day, Elizabeth carried out odd jobs around the nearby towns. She barely noticed what she was doing. All she could think about was Jane and her monstrous parents. As luck would have it, one of her last jobs was taking some decorations to the Pax yard for their Christmas party. While her load was arranged, she quickly sought out Jack and Alfie, who were chatting with Byron, Kelly, and Isabella, and told them what had happened. "We've got to rescue Jane," said Jack. "She can't go on living with those people, certainly not this close to Christmas." "I know you'd see things from my point of view," said Elizabeth, "but I'm afraid it won't be easy." "Why not?" asked Byron, who hadn't long finished his snow-ploughing shift. "We just tell the police and let them handle it." "But we don't have any proof," Elizabeth pointed out. "And if we take them to the house, who's to say Jane's parents won't give themselves up? They're more likely to make the police think we're making it all up." "Maybe we could find someone to take some photos of Jane's parents beating her up," suggested Oliver. "Oh yes, and how many photographers do you know?" Oliver looked at his caterpillar tracks. "I was only trying to help," he mumbled. "Oliver's right," said Nelson. "We need to try and get some sort of evidence. If not, we might as well give up." "Or," said Jack slowly, "instead of bringing the evidence to the police, why don't we bring them to the evidence?" There was a pause as the other machines thought this over. "We'll have to convince them that we're actually telling the truth," said Isabella at last. "It's our word against Jane's parents, and they'll most likely try and weasel their way out of it." But bullying children is a serious crime, said Kelly. We have a reliable eyewitness, he indicated to Elizabeth, so I'm sure the police will take us more seriously. And given how close it is to Christmas, they might all be in a jolly good mood. So what's the plan now? Asked Nelson. I suppose we just go to the police station and tell them about the little match girl? Precisely, Elizabeth said, ignoring Nelson's sarcasm. I think it's best if I pay them a visit, and one of you make sure Jane sells her matches and gets home. How do you know she'll be out again if she sold all her matches today? Asked Patrick. Everyone will need matches in this weather, said Isabella knowledgeably. Keeps us warm, you know. I'd be happy to look out for this Jane of yours, but I have to take fuel to the diesel works. I can't help either, said Byron. Me and Terence have got roads to clear up near the Arlesdale Railway, and Oliver's offered to fill the grit bins. I'll do it, volunteered Jack. I'm sure Jane would be glad to have me with her. The rest of us can go and tell the police. I'll come with you, suggested Alfie. We'll have a better chance of keeping her safe. The next day, which was Christmas Eve, Jack and Alfie set off to find Jane. Alfie suspected that she might be trying her luck in another town, but agreed to start looking in Tidmouth. On the way, they met Bertie. I've told Thomas and Percy about Jane, he said. They both agree that something must be done about her, but only wish they could help as well. Don't worry, said Alfie. Elizabeth's got a plan to rescue her from her parents. Bertie was about to ask what Elizabeth's plan was when his driver reminded him that he had to get back to the depot and refuel. Wishing his friends good luck, Bertie went on his way. When Jack and Alfie arrived at Tidmouth, lo and behold, there was Jane, wearing the same dress and headscarf as the day before. The only difference was that her feet were covered by a pair of bedroom slippers that had seen better days. Hello, Jane, cried Alfie. Remember us? Jane looked up and smiled when she saw who it was. Hello, she said rather awkwardly. You're Jack and Alfie, aren't you? That's us, said Jack. Are you selling any more matches today? I've got matches, but they're not really selling as fast as they were yesterday. Jane paused. Could you possibly, if it's not too much trouble, help me sell them like Elizabeth did? Jack glanced around at the passing pedestrians. I can try, he said uncertainly. Why don't we go to the bus depot again? Jane shook her head. I've already tried there, but I sold them all my matches yesterday. Some of them bought matches, but not much, and they closed a short time ago. All right, how about the station? There's bound to be lots of people there. Jane thought this was a very good idea, and they headed for the station entrance together. Then, Jane stood hopefully beside the main doors, box in hand, while Jack quickly made up a little patter, which he and Alfie shouted to passers-by. Matches for sale, crisp, fresh matches! Warms your home up a treat! Kelly, Nelson and Elizabeth drew up outside Tidmouth Police Station. A small group of constables were clustered outside. Morning, said one. This is unexpected. What can we do for you? Said another. It's a bit difficult to explain, said Kelly, but we've got something very serious to report. The constables exchanged grimaces. I'll get the Sarge, said the first constable, and hurried into the building. He came out trailed by another officer that Elizabeth recognised as Sergeant Gutenberg, head of the Tidmouth police force. These three want to tell us something, Sarge. Kelly and Nelson glanced at Elizabeth. This was her big moment. Elizabeth promptly poured out the story of Jane the Match Girl, leaving as little out as possible. There was a long silence when she had finished. That, said Sergeant Gutenberg at last, is awful. Is it true that these people were like that to their daughter? Jane, was it? True as I'm standing here, Sergeant, said Elizabeth passionately. I saw it with my own eyes, and so did Sarah. Sarah climbed down from Elizabeth's cab. I saw it too, sir. Jane's parents threatened to lock her in the attic just because we took care of her. Well then, we've got to do something about it, said the first constable. Where did you say they live? We'll head down there at once. Take it easy, Wayne, said Sergeant Gutenberg. We have to be subtler than that. He turned to Elizabeth. Where is Jane and where does she live? I can show you where she lives, sir, said Elizabeth. As for Jane, Jack and Alfie are looking after her. They're going to help her sell her matches. We've agreed to meet up with them at Jane's house, said Nelson. I wonder how they're getting on. By midday, the matches had all been sold to the tune of £30. Jane beamed up at Jack and Alfie. Thank you so much for your help, she said. Jack blushed. I'm just glad to help, but now that the matches are gone, I'd better take you home. Do you want something to eat before we go? Asked Alfie. Yes, please, said Jane eagerly, but what will my parents say? They say that I'm not allowed to spend my earnings on myself. Jack filed this little tidbit away. It doesn't have to be expensive, just something to keep you going, and it doesn't even have to be your money. I'm sure my driver can cover for you. Jack's driver Dan and Alfie's driver Len agreed to this. It didn't take them long to find a cafe, and Dan brought him, Len, and Jane bacon sandwiches. When they'd eaten, they set off for Jane's house, Jane once again giving the directions. As they turned into the street, Jack and Alfie looked around for the others but couldn't see them. Carefully, he stopped a few doors down from Jane's house. Where are they? Asked Dan. They said they'd meet us here. They're probably busy getting ready, or maybe they've been held up somewhere, Jack suggested. Who's they? Asked Jane. Just some friends of ours. Don't worry, Jane, we've got you covered. What do you mean? Wait and see. About 10 minutes later, Kelly and Nelson turned into the street, followed by a nondescript black car. Elizabeth, who had accompanied them from the police station, pulled over just out of sight of the terrace of houses. While she sat there, Sarah jumped down and hurried into the nearby phone box. Jack and Alfie caught Kelly's eye, and their friend gave them a wink. Neither they nor Nelson said anything, but they knew that each had done his bit. All right, Jane, said Jack. You'd better get inside out of the cold. Reluctantly, Jane climbed down from Jack's cab and approached her front door. In the silence that followed her knock, everyone waited with bated breath. After what seemed like ages, the door opened to reveal Jane's father. There you are, he said. What time do you call this, young lady? More to the point, how much money have you made? Jane produced her box, once again full of takings. Her father snatched it viciously and then glanced into the street. He was startled at the sight of the members of the pack, but he caught himself and said, Where's your lorry friend with the bad attitude? Jack and the others hoped Elizabeth wasn't eavesdropping. She's not here, Jane said. Jack and Alfie helped me sell the matches. Her father glanced cynically as the two diggers who scowled defiantly back. Then he turned back to his daughter. All right, you little maggot. Since you've come home early, you can clean the windows. There should be water in the kitchen. You fiend! Cried Jack before he could stop himself. You send your own daughter into the cold to sell matches, and when she gets home, you aren't even grateful to her. You just send her out to do more work. What kind of father do you call yourself? What kind of man do you call yourself? How dare you speak to my husband like that? Said a voice. Jane's mother had appeared on the scene. I don't know what ideas you've been putting into our daughter's head, but it's none of your business. So why don't you lot just shove off and let Jane get on with her work? Jack, Alfie, Kelly and Nelson revved their engines angrily, and barely a second later, two men and a woman, all in winter coats, burst out of the black car across the road. They strode up to Jane's parents, and one of them flourished a police badge. I'm Constable Wayne, he informed the stupefied couple. This is Constable Pratchett and Constable Blake, and you're both coming with us. Oh yeah? Sneered Jane's mother. You and what army? Right on cue, 2 police cars, sirens blaring, tore into the street and screeched to a halt beside Kelly. Two officers climbed out of each and surrounded Jane's parents. Behind the cars came Elizabeth, looking smugly triumphant. "You're nicked," declared Constable Pratchett. Later that day, Jack, Alfie, Kelly and Nelson stood in the Sodor Construction Company yard, telling their story to the rest of the pack. Then Jane's parents were taken away and we stayed behind to help the police with their inquiries, finished Kelly. In the end, Sergeant Gutenberg let us go and we came straight back here. Sure, mumbled Nedinor. That must have been fun. Fun? Echoed Alfie. I wouldn't call that fun. It can't have been fun for Jane anyway. You should be proud of yourselves, said Patrick. You've given Jane her life back. We can't take all the credit, said Nelson. After all, it was Elizabeth who went to Jane's aid in the first place. Speaking of Elizabeth, said Buster, where is she? She's still helping the police, explained Jack. She wouldn't leave Jane's side until she was sure she would be completely all right. Good for her, growled Byron. How long's she been at it? Well, we left the police station about 2 hours ago, said Alfie, glancing at the clock on the main building, which showed 3:30. So we've no idea when she'll be finished or what's going to happen to Jane. Just then there came the toot of a horn and Elizabeth rolled into the yard. Hello, chaps, she said wearily. Thank you for all your help today. That's all right, said Jack. How did things go at the police station? Very well. Jane's in good hands, so she won't have to go out selling matches ever again. What do you mean by that? Asked Isabella. Elizabeth gave her a cryptic smile. You'll find out tomorrow. Why tomorrow? Asked Buster. Because Miss Jenny came up to the police station and she's invited Jane to the party. Indeed I have, said a familiar voice as Miss Jenny herself climbed down from the cab, followed by Sarah. She beamed at Elizabeth, Jack, Alfie, Kelly and Nelson. Spot on, you 5. You'd make a mother proud. Because this was the highest praise Miss Jenny ever offered the pack, the 5 of them beamed with pride. So Jane's going to be all right? Asked Alfie. Absolutely. She'll be spending the night at the police station. But don't worry, said Elizabeth quickly when the machines looked anxious. She was given hot food and warm milk, and the constables are going to rummage through a local donation bank for a change of clothes. But in the meantime, WPC Blake has agreed to lend Jane her coat. That's generous of them, said Patrick. But for now, chipped in Miss Jenny, we've got a party tomorrow, and we still have some last-minute things to do. Kelly, you can help hang the tinsel and the lights. Jack, Alfie and Oliver, you can go out and find some holly and ivy to decorate the sheds. Nelson and Elizabeth, you can go and set up the signs on the road outside. Buster and Patrick, you can go and collect the food and drink. The rest of you can supervise. The pack were kept busy until 7 o'clock that evening, by which time the yard was festively decked out, ready for the party the next day. As Elizabeth sat off back to her shed, her thoughts were occupied with Jane. Sergeant Gutenberg had told her to come by the police station in the afternoon. Jane would be waiting for her, along with someone else. Christmas Day dawned bright and cold. Sodor's road vehicles started wending their way to the Sodor Construction Company's yard at around midday. Terence and Trevor were the first to arrive. Oh my! Exclaimed Trevor, gazing around. It looks beautiful! Thanks, smiled Kelly. We're glad you could come so early. Well, you'd better get used to it, said Terence. There's more of us on the way. Sure enough, arrivals came thick and fast after that, and within an hour, the yard was almost packed to bursting point. Even George and Bulgy had come, although both were claiming loudly that they weren't enjoying themselves. The vehicles chatted happily amongst themselves, spreading the gossip of the past year, while the men, women and children that Bertie and the other buses had brought enjoyed the buffet that had been set up at the rear of the yard. After a while, Bertie looked around and noticed someone was missing. "Jack?" he said. "Where's Elizabeth?" "She'll be here soon," Jack told him. "She just had to collect a rather important guest." "Who?" "You'll see." The words had hardly left him when there came the toot of a horn, and there was Elizabeth grinning all over her face. "Hello, everyone!" she cried. "Sorry I'm late." "Where on earth have you been?" asked Nelson. "I'm glad you've asked." Elizabeth turned her attention to her cab. "Come on out, dearie. It's all right. You're among friends." And who should climb down from her cab but Jane? Gone were the ragged dress and headscarf that she'd worn on the 2 previous days. Instead, she wore a bomber jacket over a simple red dress, thick, knee-length stockings, and fur-lined boots. Moreover, her face and hair had been recently washed, and she beamed around at the party. Sarah climbed out as well, and helped down an elderly woman in a blue dress. None of the vehicles, aside from Elizabeth, had seen her before, but when they saw her scoop Jane up in her arms, they quickly deduced that this was her grandmother. "Hello, Jane," said Terence. "How are you?" "I'm all right, thank you," Jane replied. "Better than I've felt in forever." Bertie glanced at Elizabeth. Where are Jane's parents?" "Safely under lock and key on a number of charges," said Elizabeth grimly. The vehicles exchanged uncomfortable looks. "Well, sorry about that," ventured Trevor. "Don't be, my dear," said Jane's grandmother. "It was them who did all those horrible things to me. I did my best to intervene, but they locked me up in the attic. Now I and my darling are free and ready to celebrate Christmas. All thanks to you." "Don't mention it," said Jack. "But what's going to happen to the pair of you?" "Well, I've been offered a job at Wellsworth Hospital," exclaimed Jane's grandmother, "so I can look after Jane myself." "And I'm going to school next year," cried Jane. "Gran's promised to make sure I'm ready when I go." "That's wonderful news," said Trevor. "I hope you'll be happy together." "Oh, we will," Jane said happily. "You've all been so good to us, especially Elizabeth." She turned to the lorry in question. "You're a wonderful lorry, Elizabeth." "I know," said Elizabeth, her voice half smug, half modest. "But we only did what anyone else would have done. Isn't that right, chaps?" The others agreed, and, under Kelly's suggestion, sent up a cheer for Jane and her grandmother. As the party got started again, the 2 of them joined in the chattering and later on the singing. "This is the best party ever," declared Jane. "I entirely agree, my darling," said her grandmother. Indeed, the party was a tremendous success for all concerned. Terence and Trevor gave the children rides to Elsbridge and back, the pack told stories about their latest projects and adventures, and the guests feasted on 3 immense roast geese bought from a butcher's in Crosby. As the night drew in, the party came to an inevitable end, and the guests started wending their way home. Jane almost begged Elizabeth to take her and her grandmother to their new house. Elizabeth agreed and took them straight there, with the promise to check on them sometime in the new year. The pack had decided to let Elizabeth sleep in their yard for the night. They were dropping off to sleep when she arrived back. "You did the right thing by helping Jane, Elizabeth," said Jack. "Who knows what would have happened to her and her gran if you hadn't." "Quite so," said Elizabeth lazily. "But this is Christmas. Who am I to turn my back if there's someone in need?" "I know what you mean," said Kelly. "Jack did something like that when he first started working with us. He rescued Thomas from a damaged bridge, and Miss Jenny let him join the crew. Remember that, Jack?" "A friend in need is a friend indeed," quoted Oliver. "There you are then," said Elizabeth with a smile. "A little charity can go a long way, especially at this time of year. Happy Christmas, chaps." Then she remembered something Jane had said as they'd parted company. "And God bless us, everyone." That was Elizabeth and the Match Girl. It was written by Steam Art, based on The Little Match Girl by Hans Christian Andersen, and read for you by TARDIS9. Okay, thank you for listening to that, everyone. As you can imagine, this story is probably one of the hardest to tell, even in its original version. I mean, what sort of a parent would treat their child like that? That is just, come on, that is just disgusting. It breaks my heart to know that there are still children who suffer like this out there, more so at this time of the year than ever. I think Elizabeth is right when she says that a little charity can go a long way, especially at Christmas. I was going to say also that, this story is just so well written. Congratulations to Steam Art for writing such a fantastic story, and, if you can't find Steam Art on YouTube, then I think you should be able to find them on the Sodor Island Forum's Pro Boards site. If you can, please go and show your support for him, as this is seriously just fantastic. But all the same though, I think we also need to be aware that however much of a happy time we have at Christmas, there are still always going to be those suffering around us. And sometimes, the kindest thing to do, especially at this time of year, even if it's not much or anything like that, is just something, anything that could bring a little happiness to anyone. Especially this Christmas, after COVID and everything, as so many families may well have been torn apart by it. And so much tragedy will have happened to them. But, I mean, I can't think of the sort of pressure that things like COVID would have had on children at this time of year. And for children who have already been suffering under lockdown, especially if they had parents like Jane's parents, it just really doesn't bear thinking about, if I'm honest. So please, if you guys can, show some support for these kids. Or do something, anything, to spread a little happiness over at Christmas, as seriously, there are so many people who really need it. Dry rails and good running, everyone, and Merry Christmas.